Inside Lucasville Prison, Ohio, America's deadliest riot. For 11 days, an American prison stopped being a prison. Correctional officers lost control. Hundreds of inmates seized an entire cell block. Hostages disappeared behind steel doors. Fires burned through the night. Armed prisoners created their own government while negotiators waited outside, uncertain who would survive until sunrise. By the time it ended, 10 people were dead, 1 correctional officer had been murdered, and the United States would never look at prison riots the same way again. This is the story of what really happened inside Lucasville Prison. Before we begin, subscribe for more in-depth crime and prison documentaries, and comment below with where you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel around the world. Now let's step inside one of America's most infamous prisons. A prison built for control. Hidden among the rolling hills of Southern Ohio sits the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility, better known simply as Lucasville Prison. From the outside, it resembles many maximum security prisons across America. Tall concrete walls. Multiple layers of razor wire. Armed observation towers overlooking every movement. Its purpose seemed straightforward. Keep dangerous men locked away. But appearances can be deceiving. Long before the riot began, the prison was becoming increasingly unstable. Built to house violent offenders and inmates serving lengthy sentences, Lucasville held individuals convicted of murder, armed robbery, gang-related violence, and other serious crimes. Many had little hope of release. When hope disappears, small problems often become explosive. The prison population continued growing while resources struggled to keep pace. Housing units became crowded. Tensions between racial groups increased. Staff shortages made supervision more difficult. Every prison develops its own unwritten rules. Lucasville was no different. Respect mattered. Weakness was noticed. Debts had consequences. And every inmate quickly learned which groups truly controlled daily life. Officially, correctional officers ran the prison. Unofficially, influence belonged to organized inmate groups. What made Lucasville particularly dangerous was that several rival organizations occupied the same institution. The Aryan Brotherhood. The Black Gangster Disciples. The Muslims. Various independent prison gangs. Each possessed its own leadership, discipline, and alliances. Most days, they maintained an uneasy balance. Everyone understood that open conflict would bring lockdowns, searches, and harsher restrictions. Peace wasn't based on friendship. It was based on mutual survival. But even stable arrangements can collapse under enough pressure. And in Lucasville, pressure had been building for years. What happened next would begin with something that seemed surprisingly small. Life before the riot. Life inside Lucasville followed routines that rarely changed. Lights came on early. Breakfast was served quickly. Movement occurred according to strict schedules. Every minute was controlled. Meals. Work assignments. Recreation. Count time. Lockdown. For correctional officers, routine created order. For inmates, routine became survival. New arrivals learned immediately that prison wasn't just governed by written regulations. Invisible rules mattered even more. Never interfere with another inmate's business. Never owe money you can't repay. Never disrespect someone's race, religion, or gang affiliation. And never appear weak. Violating these unwritten rules could bring consequences far more immediate than disciplinary reports. Violence often happened suddenly. A disagreement over a seat in the dining hall. An unpaid gambling debt. A perceived insult. Many incidents lasted only seconds before officers responded. Others were settled quietly without staff ever discovering what happened. Some inmates chose isolation. Others joined prison organizations for protection. Membership offered security. It also demanded loyalty. Leaders expected obedience. Refusing orders could be viewed as betrayal. Meanwhile, correctional officers faced their own challenges. Managing hundreds of inmates required experience, awareness, and constant attention. One mistake could trigger a fight involving dozens of prisoners. Every officer understood the importance of reading the atmosphere. Sometimes tension could almost be felt in the air. Long before violence erupted. Many later said that something about early 1993 felt different. Conversations became quieter. Rumors spread more frequently. Certain inmate leaders held unusually long discussions. No one outside those circles knew exactly what was being planned. Or if anything was being planned at all. But behind locked cell doors, decisions were already being made. And one prison policy was about to ignite years of frustration. What appeared to be an administrative decision would soon become the spark that changed everything. The spark nobody expected. The immediate issue centered around mandatory tuberculosis testing. Health officials wanted inmates tested using skin injections. Most prisoners accepted the procedure. A small number did not. Among some Muslim inmates, religious concerns emerged regarding ingredients reportedly associated with the testing process. Whether those concerns were medically justified became almost secondary. Inside prison, perception often matters as much as fact. Several inmates believed they were being forced to violate deeply held religious beliefs. Negotiations between prison officials and inmate representatives failed to produce agreement. Frustration grew. Trust, already fragile, weakened further. Yet the disagreement alone wasn't enough to explain what followed. The testing controversy became a symbol. It represented years of accumulated resentment. Complaints about overcrowding. Allegations of excessive force. Concerns regarding medical care. Perceived racial tensions. Disciplinary practices many inmates believed were unfair. Each grievance alone might not have caused catastrophe. Combined, they created an environment where almost any spark could start a fire. Then came Easter Sunday. April 11, 1993. A day that began like countless others. Within hours, it would become one of the darkest chapters in American correctional history. Easter Sunday. The morning appeared ordinary. Officers followed standard procedures. Inmates attended scheduled activities. Nothing suggested that history was about to unfold. Then, inside L Block, control disappeared. A confrontation escalated rapidly. Inmates overwhelmed correctional officers. Keys changed hands. Doors that should have remained locked suddenly opened. Within minutes, hundreds of inmates occupied large sections of the cell block. Correctional staff retreated where possible. Others became hostages. The prison had crossed a line from disturbance to full-scale uprising. Smoke soon filled parts of the housing unit. Furniture became barricades. Makeshift weapons appeared. Communication with inmates became increasingly difficult. Outside, emergency response teams mobilized immediately. State officials faced an extraordinary challenge. Storm the building and risk mass casualties? Or negotiate with armed prisoners controlling dozens of lives? Neither option offered certainty. Inside the occupied block, inmate leaders quickly recognized another danger. Chaos itself. Without organization, random violence could spiral beyond anyone's control. Remarkably, something unexpected happened. Several influential inmate leaders from rival organizations began working together. Not because they trusted each other. Because survival demanded cooperation. They established rules. They assigned responsibilities. They attempted to prevent uncontrolled killings. For a brief moment, bitter enemies shared one objective: maintain enough order to strengthen their bargaining position. But maintaining order inside a prison taken over by inmates proved far more difficult than anyone imagined. Because hidden among hundreds of prisoners were individuals seeking revenge. And once revenge begins, controlling it becomes nearly impossible. 11 days without control. As the first hours passed, it became clear that this would not be another prison disturbance ending before nightfall. Lucasville had become something far more dangerous. Entire sections of L Block remained under inmate control. Correctional officers and civilian staff who had been unable to escape were now prisoners themselves. Outside the prison walls, hundreds of law enforcement officers gathered. The Ohio State Highway Patrol established security around the facility. Special response teams prepared for the possibility of a forced assault. Helicopters circled overhead. Television crews arrived from across the country. No one knew exactly what was happening behind the concrete walls. Inside, information traveled only through rumor. Some inmates believed tactical teams would storm the building before sunrise. Others believed negotiations would succeed within hours. Neither prediction proved true. The standoff stretched into another day. Then another. Soon, everyone inside understood a frightening reality. They were on their own. Food became one of the first major concerns. The prison kitchen was no longer operating normally. Supplies inside the occupied area were limited. Meals became irregular. Water was available, but distributing it safely was another challenge. Even basic hygiene became increasingly difficult. The smell inside the housing unit slowly changed. Smoke from small fires mixed with sweat, blood, damp concrete, and overflowing trash. The air grew heavier each day. Sleep became almost impossible. Bright lights remained on. People shouted throughout the night. Every unexpected sound caused dozens of heads to turn. Nobody fully trusted anyone else. Every conversation carried consequences. A careless comment could be interpreted as taking sides. And inside a prison where the rules had disappeared, taking the wrong side could be fatal. Yet despite the chaos, something remarkable was unfolding. The inmate leaders were trying to prevent complete anarchy. What happened next surprised even experienced correctional officials. Instead of descending immediately into uncontrolled violence, the occupied cell block developed its own structure. one created entirely by prisoners. The prisoners create their own government. Maximum security prisons already have unofficial leadership. Lucasville simply made it visible. Within hours of taking control, influential inmates recognized that discipline was essential. If dozens of frightened prisoners acted independently, negotiations would collapse almost immediately. So they organized. Representatives from different racial and religious groups met repeatedly. Among them were leaders connected to the Aryan Brotherhood, Muslim inmates, and members of black prison organizations. Under normal circumstances, many of these men would never willingly cooperate. Years of rivalry separated them. Some had fought one another before arriving at Lucasville. Others had sworn loyalty to organizations that viewed each other as enemies. But the situation forced a temporary alliance. Their shared objective was simple: keep the prison from descending into complete bloodshed. Decisions were discussed collectively. Messengers carried instructions throughout the occupied block. Lookouts monitored entrances. Specific inmates were assigned to watch hostages. Others handled supplies. Improvised medical care was organized for those who had been injured during the takeover. Witnesses later described an atmosphere unlike anything they had ever experienced. The prison still contained murderers, gang members, and violent offenders. Yet many followed orders with surprising discipline. Not because they had suddenly changed. Because everyone understood the consequences of failure. If negotiations collapsed, special response teams would almost certainly enter by force. And few believed they would survive such an assault. The leadership also understood something else. The hostages represented their greatest leverage. Keeping them alive increased the possibility of negotiations. Hurting them would almost certainly end any chance of a peaceful resolution. Unfortunately, not every inmate agreed. Hidden beneath the appearance of cooperation were personal grudges years in the making. Old feuds. Gang rivalries. Revenge that had nothing to do with negotiations. As the days passed, those tensions became harder to control. And then the killings began. When revenge took over, the first deaths changed everything. Violence inside a prison is never random. Even during riots, there is usually a reason. Sometimes it is revenge. Sometimes fear. Sometimes a belief that someone has become a threat. During the Lucasville uprising, several inmates accused others of cooperating with prison officials. Some believed certain prisoners might become informants after the riot ended. Others settled long-standing personal conflicts under the cover of chaos. The result was deadly. 9 inmates lost their lives during the 11-day standoff. Some were strangled. Others were beaten. Several were killed after being accused of betrayal. One correctional officer, 40-year-old Robert Vallandigham, also lost his life. He had been taken hostage during the initial takeover. His death shocked negotiators outside and deeply affected correctional staff throughout Ohio. For officers gathered beyond the walls, the situation became even more painful. Many personally knew the hostages still trapped inside. Friends, partners, people they had worked alongside for years. Every hour without news increased the anxiety. Families waited desperately for updates. Phones rang continuously. Rumors spread faster than verified information. Officials released very little publicly. They feared that inaccurate reports could make negotiations even more dangerous. Inside the occupied block, the emotional strain became overwhelming. Some inmates later admitted they expected to die. Others believed a military-style assault was only hours away. Several hostages later described living minute by minute, never knowing whether the next conversation might save them or end their lives. The psychological pressure affected everyone. Hostages, correctional officers, negotiators, and even the inmate leaders attempting to keep control. But outside the prison walls, another battle was taking place. Not with weapons. With words. Because every decision made during negotiations carried enormous consequences. The negotiations that could not fail. State officials understood the stakes. A forced assault could rescue the hostages. It could also trigger a massacre. L Block's narrow corridors favored defenders. The inmates knew the layout. They had barricaded entrances. Many possessed improvised weapons. Although reports varied regarding exactly what weapons had been assembled, officials believed entering by force would almost certainly result in significant casualties among both inmates and staff. Negotiation became the preferred strategy. Communication began through handwritten messages and face-to-face discussions conducted under tightly controlled conditions. Every message moved slowly. Every promise required careful consideration. The inmate representatives presented demands. Among them were concerns about religious accommodations, prison conditions, medical treatment, disciplinary policies, and assurances regarding how participants would be treated after surrendering. Officials refused many requests. Others remained open for discussion. Neither side fully trusted the other. Negotiators knew that every hour bought valuable time. Fatigue could reduce violence. Emotions might cool. Leaders inside might become more willing to compromise. Meanwhile, inmate representatives understood they faced another problem. The longer the occupation continued, the harder it became to maintain discipline. Supplies continued shrinking. Exhaustion spread. Small disagreements became larger. People stopped thinking clearly. Even loyal followers began questioning leadership decisions. The temporary alliance that had held together during the first days was beginning to crack. And if that alliance collapsed, the final hours of the riot could become even deadlier than the first. What no one outside could fully appreciate was the enormous psychological burden now resting on every decision made inside L Block. Because each passing day made peaceful surrender seem both more necessary and more difficult. The breaking point. By the end of the first week, the atmosphere inside L Block had changed completely. The confidence that had existed during the first hours of the uprising was fading. Exhaustion had replaced adrenaline. The inmates had now lived under constant stress for days. Few had slept properly. Many had eaten very little. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the same question. How does this end? The inmate leaders understood that every additional day increased the risk of disaster. The hostages were becoming physically and emotionally exhausted. Some required medical attention. Others had spent days wondering whether they would ever see their families again. At the same time, correctional officials outside the prison were under growing pressure. Families wanted answers. The public wanted the prison retaken. Law enforcement officers who had surrounded Lucasville for days were prepared to act if negotiations failed. But those closest to the situation understood one thing. Once tactical teams entered the occupied block, there would be no way to control what followed. The narrow hallways, blind corners, reinforced doors, and homemade barricades would turn every step into a deadly confrontation. Even a successful assault could cost dozens of lives. Negotiators continued talking. Every hour mattered. Every message was carefully chosen. Every word carried weight. Behind the scenes, inmate representatives slowly began accepting a reality they had resisted since Easter Sunday. The prison could not remain under their control forever. The question was no longer whether the riot would end. It was how many more people would die before it did. What happened next would determine how history remembered Lucasville. The surrender. On April 21, 1993, after 11 days, the riot finally came to an end. Following lengthy negotiations, inmate leaders agreed to surrender. One by one, prisoners began leaving the occupied housing unit. Many walked with their hands raised. Others were immediately restrained and searched. Hostages emerged exhausted, emotionally drained, and in desperate need of medical attention. For many officers waiting outside, it was the first moment they knew friends and colleagues were still alive. Relief spread quickly. But it was mixed with heartbreak. The damage inside L Block revealed the true cost of the uprising. Entire sections of the prison had been destroyed. Windows were shattered. Walls were blackened by smoke. Cells had been ripped apart. Furniture had become barricades. Blood-stained concrete floors. Investigators carefully documented every room before anyone disturbed the evidence. The official death toll confirmed the scale of the tragedy. 9 inmates had been killed. Correctional officer Robert Vallandigham had been murdered while being held hostage. Dozens of other people had suffered injuries ranging from minor wounds to severe trauma. The Lucasville riot became one of the longest prison sieges in American history. It also became one of the deadliest. Yet for investigators, the real work was only beginning. Because ending the riot did not answer the most important question. Who was responsible for the deaths? The investigation. The investigation lasted for years. Hundreds of witnesses were interviewed. Thousands of pages of evidence were collected. Every movement inside L Block during those 11 days had to be reconstructed. That proved incredibly difficult. Many inmates refused to cooperate. Others gave conflicting accounts. Some feared retaliation. Others hoped to reduce their own punishment. Sorting fact from rumor became one of the largest prison investigations in Ohio history. Eventually, prosecutors brought charges against several inmates believed to have played leading roles in the riot and in the killings that occurred during the standoff. Some accepted plea agreements. Others stood trial. Several received death sentences under Ohio law at the time. Years later, legal challenges, appeals, and debates over witness credibility continued. Some convictions became the subject of significant public discussion. Attorneys argued over whether certain testimony had been truthful or influenced by plea deals. Families of the victims continued searching for answers. Former hostages carried emotional scars long after leaving the prison. Many correctional officers admitted they never viewed prison work the same way again. For those who survived the 11 days inside Lucasville, the memories never truly disappeared. The riot had ended. Its consequences had not. How Lucasville changed American prisons. The Lucasville riot forced correctional systems across the United States to examine their own vulnerabilities. Investigators identified multiple lessons. Communication between prison administrators and inmate populations became a greater priority. Emergency response plans were revised. Hostage training improved. Intelligence gathering inside prisons received far more attention. Many correctional systems expanded the monitoring of gang activity. Staff training evolved to better recognize warning signs before tensions reached a crisis point. Religious accommodation policies also received closer review. Officials recognized that seemingly small disputes could become far more dangerous when layered on top of years of distrust. Perhaps the greatest lesson was one that could not be measured in reports or policy manuals. Maximum security prisons depend on far more than concrete walls and steel bars. They depend on order, on communication, on trust, however limited that trust may be. When those foundations begin to crack, even the strongest prison can become fragile. Lucasville proved that a prison does not lose control all at once. It loses control one unresolved problem at a time. The legacy of Lucasville. Today, Southern Ohio Correctional Facility continues to operate. New inmates arrive. Others leave. Correctional officers begin each shift much as they always have. To someone passing by on the highway, it looks like another secure American prison. Few would guess that behind these walls unfolded one of the most significant prison uprisings in modern U.S. history. The Lucasville riot lasted only 11 days. But its legacy has lasted decades. It exposed the dangers of overcrowding, poor communication, racial division, religious conflict, and the fragile balance that exists inside every maximum security prison. It reminded the nation that prisons are designed to contain violence, not to eliminate it. And when that balance finally breaks, the consequences can extend far beyond the prison walls. The concrete has been repaired. The broken windows replaced. The smoke cleared long ago. But the story of Lucasville remains a lasting reminder that even the most secure institutions can become the setting for unimaginable tragedy when warning signs are ignored. The Lucasville prison riot remains one of the most complex and consequential correctional crises in American history. Its lessons continue to influence prison operations and security decades later. If you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more true crime and prison documentaries, and share your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and thank you for watching.